Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Future of podcast. My name is Prieeyya and I'm the founder of a startup called Our Wave Hub. And I have maybe two of the funniest people I know. On the episode today, we have Andy Wadsworth from Red Academy and Daniela Pico from Riipen. Andy, how did you start with... I forgot to mention the topic of the podcast.
Oh, right. We're here for a reason.
Yeah. What we're talking about today, or the theme question is your education future-proof? And we have these conversations on the regular, so I'm excited to have this one with you guys. Andy, we'll start with how you got started with Red, and side note, he has a British accent. So you're welcome.
Yes. Thank you for having me on. This is really awesome. I got involved in education. I didn't take sort of a traditional route. My background is in events and music festivals and digital marketing, and then I sort of came across Red. So I don't have the sort of traditional route, but I've definitely can talk to sort of my experience in education and sort of why getting involved with Red was really attractive. And I've been with Red Academy, which is a tech and design school with campuses in Vancouver and Toronto here in Canada. And I came across Red through sort of a friend, and they were looking for somebody to sort of start new partnerships. That was their big thing. And I sort of fell in love with Red with just first of all with the founder Colin. He was a really sort of energetic, sort of bubbling guy. Like if you cut his arms off, he'd be mute. Like he talks with his full body. He doesn't talk with just his mouth. He's incredibly inspiring, and anybody that knows him is like, he's a great guy. And just the goal towards his approach to education. We're sort of living in a sort of, especially in the tech sector, like such a fast-paced world that things are changing all the time, and the education we provide in sort of 3-month and 6-month modules is geared towards getting people the skills they need to be job ready, and that's the number one reason why people come to Red. They're looking to get employed in the tech sector, and Red's that sort of route towards that.
And so for those who aren't familiar with Red, would you say that Red is a boot camp?
Yeah, that's the most relatable way of doing it. We teach UX design, UI design, web development and app development, and digital marketing. And it's that intensive, short education period, very experiential learning. So there's working with real client projects, very similar to Riipen and the work Daniela does, and it's really putting people through the motions and getting them sort of the experience they need. So when they go out into the workplace, they've actually got some meat on the bones of their experience. They can sort of understand situations and roll with the punches.
Very cool. Danny, how did you start with Riipen and with your interest? Because we have these conversations literally all the time, right? So it's definitely not, I would say, a job for you being in the future of workspace. It's more of something or a topic that you're super passionate about. How did this intrigue you, and how did you get started?
Yeah, definitely. That's a good question. So I think if I reflect back on it, my obsession with the future of work and generally just changing the way that the academic system is structured started when I was in post-secondary school. So when I did my post-secondary studies at the University of Victoria, my first degree was in psychology, which I loved. It was brilliant, but I very vividly remember going into the co-op office and finding out that the career options that they had for me were there was 2 options for my co-op program. I could either do an internship at a summer camp, or I could go and work as a international security borders agent.
Very cool.
None of
which I can see you doing, by the way.
interested me at all. And I remember this like devastating moment where I realized that this was the degree that I was doing, and now that I decided to not go into my master's, these were the career options that were outlined for me, and it was very anxiety inducing for me. And so at that point, I think that I really started to become a lot more interested in the relevance of education and where it can take you, but more specifically understanding that the academic pathway and the post-career pathway are not always related. So following my psychology degree, I went back and did a business degree again at the University of Victoria, a lot more applied at that time. And a lot of my student leadership and advocacy was in the relevancy of the academic curriculum and kind of bringing forward questions about what we were teaching and why we were teaching it. I find nothing more frustrating than students having to question why something that they're getting taught as part of the classroom is relevant, especially given the cost of education nowadays. So obviously following graduation, meeting Dana, who's the CEO of Riipen, and learning about their story and their focus. For those of you that don't know, Riipen is a web-based platform that facilitates project-based learning in the classroom. So the whole idea is bringing together students, post-secondary schools, and companies so that the students can be doing real industry projects in the classroom and thereby applying what they're learning. So taking the theory that you learn in the class and putting it towards a real industry challenge. So their mission has always been to change the way that education is delivered and facilitate for post-secondary schools bringing in this type of learning. And so for me, it was just a great fit.
Very cool. We'll dive right into the meat of today, which is sort of exploring the theme whether education is future-proof in a time where technology is getting better at an exponential pace, right? And so the first question would be, what's your opinion, or what are some of your thoughts on the gap that exists between how talent is developed today? So talent meaning students in high school, undergrad, graduate degrees, and what industry looks for in talent. I've heard, and a lot of our ways work is in sort of bridging and finding ways to fill that gap and fill that void. In your opinion, what is that gap? Like, what is the gap between how students are being taught and what industry looks for in talent?
Let's start with the small question.
Let's just start with like a really easy icebreaker.
This was like a boom.
I'll sort of take a start, and you'll definitely do better. So I think everybody's education, like any other industry, is going through huge disruption. And I think it's very easy to sit on either side of the fence and say, like, it's your fault, it's education's fault, and the industry's, it's their fault because they're not sort of, getting people ready. So I'm actually quite optimistic about education, and I think that there was sort of universities or sort of education establishments where they were the sort of the source of knowledge, like that you had to go there, that's where it all was, and then the internet and technologies changed that totally. For the good or bad is a different discussion, but you can go on lynda.com or anything to go on through, or YouTube has a bunch of videos to learn anything, and I think what it's done is it's just opened education up to, like,
it's democratized it,
very much,
right?
So, yeah. And I feel it's changed the way that we actually learn. Like, if I want to just do a simple thing like cook a new recipe, I'll just go to YouTube and go on through there, or there's a bunch of other sites and stuff. But I just feel that education, it's just sort of reacting to it and sort of trying to adjust. And I think I work in the boot camp space, and I live in my bubble where we're the best thing in the world, and this is how education should work. And I don't agree with that. It's just a different way of teaching, and it's not for everybody, but it's for some people. And then the majority of our students, their average age is about 28 years old, and most have a post-secondary degree, so they're coming back to education to something's happened in their life. They've gone through something changed, like they've lost their job, or they've hit a glass ceiling, or they're doing something they're not passionate about. So an intensive short-term sort of education experience is exactly what they need to give them the skills to go out there.
Right.
But I think it's actually an exciting time, like where education and technology are sort of finding how to work with it. Yeah, exactly. I think there's lots of opportunity when disruption happens, and you embrace it or you try and fight it. But I think if the organizations that and universities or schools that are embracing it are doing awesome things and great things.
Yeah, definitely.
Daniel, what would you say?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that it's an amazing time for education. It's an incredible time to be working in the space, and especially, I think to answer your question of like where the gap is, all the way from K to 12 and then the post-secondary school system, we are working with a system that was essentially designed during the Industrial Revolution. And we were talking about a very specific type of worker. And so the way that we looked at education then was kind of assembly line style. So you went through K to 12. If you could, you went to post-secondary, then you got a job, and then you worked at that job, and
Forever.
then you died.
Yeah.
It was like very streamlined. But now the world is changing so rapidly that there's all kinds of different numbers around how many careers we're all going to have. But education has to adapt to that, because we as humans will also be adapting to it, and it's a service ultimately. So I think the gap exists in the fact that because we haven't changed that system in such a long time, now we're here and the pace of innovation is rapid, and our institutions and we need to also be changing really rapidly with it.
What do you think's stopping us? Like, there's so many stakeholders within the context of education, right? It's no longer just school, student, and employer. There's the college or university, and then there are boot camps. There are tech solutions or tech platforms and marketplaces, right? What do you think's stopping us from finding ways to break silos? Because the big question, or these institutions like specifically colleges and universities are so big that sometimes change for them is hard, right? But what's stopping us from partnering on that change, or how can we better prepare students that in a way that is industry relevant and industry specific, but also doesn't necessarily take away from the want or need to go through post-secondary education?
I can definitely take a stab at the first part of that question in terms of what's holding us back. I think it's similar to my last question. There's systems that have been put in place, and I think those systems were put in place for good reasons. But now we need to go back and look at whether or not those reasons were still relevant. So speaking specifically to colleges and universities, which kind of have a bad reputation for moving very, very slowly. And I think that is true in a lot of cases, but I see through my work the willingness to innovate. So I think there's a big push right now to do things differently. And sometimes it's just the red tape around them that doesn't allow them to do that necessarily. And I think that red tape comes from systems that were meant to protect, but are no longer that relevant. Like, the example I always use is in some institutions, the time for you to develop and approve a new course can be up to 2 years. At the pace at which we're moving right now, within 2 years, the course content might not even be relevant anymore.
Yep.
So I think that looking at that and then removing the fear of change, I think, Prieeyya, you've heard me say this millions of times, but I think the challenge that we have right now in education and changing the system is so large that we could all be working on it together and there would still be room to innovate. So I think that what I actively try to work on is removing that fear of like, the boot camps are going to eat my lunch if I allow them to come into my program, and then replacing that with, okay, how can we as a system disrupt ourselves so that we can then become better and innovate for the ultimate good of the students?
Right.
Definitely, yeah. I think partnerships are going to be a huge sort of thing we're going to see more of in education, and just that embracing different things and trying new things. That's going to be a big thing. But I think sort of to Danny's point is we need to go back to understand what success looks like in education. Like, what do I want to achieve in life? Do I want to be an entrepreneur? Do I want to be like the next philosopher. Like there's different reasons now that you're going into education, and it's understanding how we measure what success looks like, and that's working with if industry, for example, wanting to go into employment. If you look at a job description, it says that must have a master's or a bachelor's degree in X. Is that actually really important for that job and to the employer? Do they care anymore? And you're seeing a lot of like the larger companies move away from having that accreditation because they're like, well, actually, I just want the person to be very good at their job and have experience in this. So it's just understanding from sort of like different partners of like why it's so important to like really have this sort of accreditation. If in essence it's not sort of essential to them doing their job if they want to get into the workforce. If they want to like go into something academic and stuff, I totally get it. Hopefully anybody running a nuclear power plant, somebody checks their sort of accreditation. You're like, yeah, you definitely need that. But if you're going into sales or something, like experience is such a big part of it. So let's design sort of job descriptions or anything geared towards that instead of being so stringent on if you don't have this, you don't get in.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Segueing into a little bit more about the opportunity within education, and one big opportunity is innovating on learning design or program design, right? Because as Danny, as you mentioned, designing curriculum at these colleges or universities or large institutions takes up a lot of time. In your own roles and in your experience, how have you innovated on learning design? Like, I know Red does a lot of really cool courses and cool stuff. What was your experience with that? And Riipen is in classroom, right? So you're like every day in the classroom disrupting traditional classroom models. Talk a little bit about like how that's been.
Do you want to go?
Yeah, I can start. So I'm lucky enough to work with some really, really smart people, and our curriculum designers are very passionate, and they don't just live on their own in the little island. They're working very closely with industry partners, other academic partners, and ultimately our students to really get an understanding of, okay, what do you want? What's the next big thing? Data science, cybersecurity, in our little tech space. And then working with industry partners to make sure that like the curriculum we do have is the best and most desirable sort of skills that they need to be hiring for. For example, in our sort of tech stack is JavaScript, HTML, CSS as the coding languages we work in, and the reason for that is it's the most used language globally. A lot of our partners they're on the same stack, so for our students to graduate, it's a clear path. We're kind of giving them the skills that they need. But if we work with industry and say like Ruby on Rails is the next language, great, we need to pivot quickly to make sure that if students come to Red, we're teaching them the skills. And I think that's where we're very lucky to have industry partners that we work closely with. And we've, as a company, just got that flexibility to like listen and have that finger on the pulse to pivot quite quickly. And again, it's watching the guys put it together and sort of trial it in class and try new things. It's really experiential, and they're incredibly smart, and yeah, it's great to watch them do it.
Yeah, for sure. I think I mean, it would be ridiculous for us to take credit for some of the innovation that happens on the platform. I really think like more than what we've done is like created a platform for people to innovate within it. And so what we do a lot of the times is work with faculty members or work with industry who has an idea about how their projects can be implemented into the curriculum, and we work with them more to create that feedback loop. So the conversations I have a lot of the time with faculty are around, okay, let's talk about your class. What are the industry relevant components of your class? Or a question I oftentimes ask them is, if you had your students go into a job interview, what would you hope that they highlighted from what they learned in your classroom?
Right.
And I think for a lot of them, it's just about changing the frame of mind. And I mean, keep in mind, a lot of the times we're talking to people who are really actively seeking opportunities to do this. So I think it's mostly them innovating and then us just facilitating that process. And then what Andy mentioned, I just want to echo about creating those feedback loops. One of the things I see as a really, really important gap in us talking about future-proofing education is around, do we have those feedback systems in place between industry and all educational institutions, so that I know that what I'm teaching my students is relevant today and also relevant tomorrow. And if it stops being relevant, then I'm hearing about it immediately and fast enough to make those changes. So
and you can pivot.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. That's really cool.
I think creating a space for educators specifically and like curriculum designers to experiment, that's key as well. Like failing is, you know, that's part of learning. Like that's the big part. And I think you know, there's traditional systems that see failing as like that. You know,
it's like a taboo.
Exactly,
right?
Yeah, and it's something that should
which
be
then
encouraged.
builds mindset.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so interesting to me though, because I feel that, so having gone to business school, one of the first things that they teach you in business is you need to fail fast. And I think now being on the other side of it and looking at not just like, not to pick on higher education, I think it's institutions at large. Like you can see this in our government, you can see this in our healthcare system. There's this horrible fear of failure and therefore a lack of innovation. And so I think that what we need to work on is how do we change the reward system so that people are actually able to comfortably fail and know that they're not going to lose their jobs because they did that.
Do you think it's a question of like institutions at large incentivizing students to try?
I think it's a student problem, but I also think it's a faculty problem. Like if you look at the way that the systems of reward currently work for faculty members, a lot of them aren't even focused on teaching in traditional higher ed institutions, especially research universities. Faculty, it's a component of their overall compensation or rewarding system, but it's not the main
priority
piece.
Yeah.
So, and that's not to say like research institutions have an immense amount of value, but when it comes to educating students, they're not always being incentivized to change up their curriculum, which is why we get, you know, these faculty members that have been teaching the exact same thing for the last 30 years and haven't even changed their, you know, PowerPoint deck. If there was PowerPoint 30 years ago.
They got the overhead projector slides. Like,
Yeah.
Now there are fancy tools like Prezi.
Yeah, and I think there's
Google
some people
Slides.
that are like very, very keen and changing it all the time. But I find something that's frustrating for me personally is that a lot of the faculty members that I work with that are doing this, it's very out of the goodness of their heart. Like they are doing it because they know that it's a good thing for the students, because they want to change, because they want to provide high quality education. But what I see is them taking on a lot of the risk and then not necessarily being rewarded or incentivized to do so. So what you're asking them to do is innovate in a way that might put their jobs on the line.
Right.
And then they're never rewarded when something goes well.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of like like being an educator or a teacher, instructor. It's genuinely like a passion. You know, they do put their heart and souls into everything, and they genuinely care about the students' success. Like you're in a classroom for, you know, either years or months, and you get to know these people on a personal level, so you're part of their journey. And, you know, we can definitely do a better job of rewarding our instructors and saying thank you more. Like it's I think education in general doesn't get enough of it. And, you know, when they do have those like little victories, they need to be celebrated, because it's tough. Like I couldn't do it myself. Like it's tough on them.
So one perspective is also now that it's grad season, right? Like everyone's just graduated. On the student perspective, there's a lot of anxiety around now what, right? Like I've gotten this 4-year degree, and this is just an example, right? There's so many other levels at which students are graduating. I'm picking one example of students that have graduated with an undergrad degree and still feel that now they still have no idea of what comes next, right? What do you think the opportunity is for them? In a time, now...
This is a deep question.
Deep sigh.
And he's just like, okay, bye. It's like,
she's gone rogue. There is not one question on here I prepped for.
That's too funny. I'm just feeding off of...
Yeah.
Oh my god, stop the mic. But I'm just feeding off of what you're saying.
Yeah.
But... Does that make sense?
Yeah,
like
no.
Yeah.
because now we've spoken a lot about institutions and educators and industry partners, but for the student in a time where tech is advancing so fast, what is the opportunity for them?
I think it's exciting. Like, it's an exciting time to be in general, like at any stage of your career, because when you look at it, we are looking at careers differently. So you're no longer faced with the pressure of making what at that time feels like a crippling decision to take a job that you might not be interested in. And so I think for students, it's a really exciting time, and there is certainly lots of people working on the challenge of how do we point people in the right direction. And so I think it's okay to graduate and then go to a red style program when you realize that you're missing those technical skills to go and launch you into your next career. Or it's okay to take a job in an area that you don't know if you're interested in and then stay at that job for a while and then potentially move on. Like, all of those things are not as limiting as they used to be. And even just a few weeks ago, we were having a conversation about how things are changing to be more focused on the gig economy and what that means for people.
That's a
having,
podcast episode to come.
for having different opportunities in their career. But I do want to address to the point of students graduating with a clear idea of what they want to do next. There's still a big debate going on in higher education whether or not that's the purpose of higher education.
Right.
And I think I want to bring this forward because I think it's a really important conversation to be having, because whenever I've heard people have this conversation, it's such an either or. Like, there's an immense amount of value to higher education that is not associated with your career. I think it gives you a time to think, to reflect on yourself, to nurture your own ideas, to grow as an individual, to be a free thinker, to think critically, to meet people that are different than yourself. I think all of these things are incredibly, incredibly valuable. And you don't necessarily get that same type of experience at a shorter term program. So even just the length of it is valuable in those ways. But I think that when people talk about it, it's so black or white. I think there's an opportunity for us to do both. Like, if students graduated feeling like they've developed all those skills and had that time to nurture, and then also had at least a clear idea of what potentially could come next, I think that's the perfect type of scenario we're looking at.
Yeah, like I think the first thing I'd say to a grad that it's okay if you don't know what you want to do. And I know that's kind of like a little bit of a cliche, and they're saying, well, you know, I've got $60,000 worth of debt. It's not okay. Like, yeah, that's very true. But it's like travel, like try a bunch of different jobs, like really put yourself out there to see what you like doing. Because the one piece of advice I give to sort of all the students that start at Red is, you know, choose when you go for a job, make sure it's the right company for you. You're going to be committing a lot of your time, like 5 days a week to that, maybe even more, to being there. So make sure you enjoy being in that job, doing what you want to do. It shouldn't just be take the first thing you get and be happy with it. Really make sure the company aligns with you as a person, your values. There's flexibility if that's important to you. If they want to just pay you a ton of money and that's what you want, great. Like, but it's just put yourself out there and have lots of experience, and it doesn't have to be right every time. Like, if you start a company and you hate it, like, you can leave. The one thing you're not allowed to do is stay at that company for the next 5 years and complain. Like, that's not fair. And I think it's but it's tough out there. I think, you know, it's an aggressive sort of hiring market, and, you know, students are having to do so much more to stand out from the crowd. And yeah, it's definitely difficult, but it's okay not to know that, like, this is going to be my career for the next 25 years. You know, try something out, and if it fails, come to Red Academy.
I was waiting for that.
That was a stealth.
And we'll get you back out on the road. It's okay.
And then after Red, I mean, through Red, even go to Riipen.
That's the plan.
No, but it's I think so, you know, education used to be you go to university, and then that was kind of not the end of education, but that was the large part. Now it's lifelong learning.
So
It's
exciting.
got to be, like, everybody's got to be comfortable to always be wanting to learn and always be expected to learn. Like, the things I did in university, I've learned more along my career of just taking more courses, putting myself in more, like, different experiences to gain that knowledge and sort of flexibility. And I think the biggest another piece of advice is just for students that they need to be uncomfortable with uncertainty, because that's what I see for my life anyway. Is that there's nothing like the conveyor belt of a job is not there anymore. Things are going to be jumping so much faster. And into your next podcast, the gig economy, that's definitely where like the promotion's out already. But companies are looking at that, like, how do we have more freelancers? How do we find specialists with specific skills for a specific task? Have them for a short period of time, and then that's it. They're moving on. And the gig economy opens up, instead of just being Canada, what about the globe? Your skills are transferable, so why don't you use it in that sense? So
yeah, no, that's a whole other conversation.
That's another podcast.
Yeah, try to get an invite back.
You guys have to come back. He's positioning.
Plot twist, it's always us.
That's too funny. Another question, and this is just out of curiosity, I'm sorry, it's not in the paper, but a lot of what you've been saying is that it's not binary anymore, right? It's not like black and white of this is the end of your road to learning, and then after that you're on to your career, whatever that looks like, right? What's the role of giving students exposure to different things? And I know this maybe ties into Riipen and its ethos of exposing students to industry. I feel like personally the role that exposure's played in my own life is it has disproportionate impact, right? Like how do you think institutions, whether it's boot camps or schools, can better expose or expose students to more things so that they have better understanding of who they are and what their skill set is?
For sure. I think, obviously this is at the core of what Riipen does. A conversation that we have all the time is around how do we offer students more opportunities for career clarity, which to us means opportunities to figure out what you like, but also what you don't like.
Yeah.
And obviously the approach that we've taken to it, not to say this is the only approach, the right approach is to try to embed as much of this as we can into academic life.
Right.
But I think it's a twofold answer. Like, our institutions need to do more, but also students need to do more in taking those opportunities, recognizing them, and seeking them out. Because if there's anything I've learned through my work in partnerships is that there's lots of people who are willing to provide opportunities, and they're looking for students who are wanting to take that initiative and take that step forward. So I think there's a lot of work we can do to institutionalize these types of opportunities, democratize them, and make sure that everybody has equal access to them. But there's also a lot of work that students could be doing to seek out more of those opportunities for themselves.
Yeah, that was super well put.
I definitely can't top that. Experiential learning is, I think, I'm a big believer in learn by doing. I think it's only way you can really sort of understand the pain points. And again, it's not geared towards, it doesn't always have to be successful. The best learnings or the best experiences can often be where it all went horribly wrong.
Right.
Had a few of those. But it's you can see when you've been through something where it went wrong, or you went through a bad experience, the next time you go through that experience, you can flag things really early and say, like, okay, don't go down that path because of this. But you can only have that. You only know about that because you went through it. And again, very similar to Riipen, that's the core part of our sort of education at Red. We work with community partners and charities and non-profits and startups to get digital briefs that our students physically work on. And it's all pro bono for those organizations. And the bonus for that is that the organizations that wouldn't be able to afford it get free digital work, and our students in return get that experience. The client might not be the best, or the project might be really difficult and it didn't go right, but there's always something that they'll be able to, when they talk to a hiring partner, be able to talk about. And that's the most important thing with our hiring partners. They can see from your portfolio and your resume you can do X, Y, Z in your field, but how did you do that? Like, how did you build that website? What went wrong? What went right? Can you actually talk through the process? Because that's what they really want to understand. They want to know that this good or bad, that this is a process, and they learn from that. So when I put them into my team, they'll be able to sort of roll with the punches and go through that. And
I also think that like that's life.
Yeah.
And I feel like part of the challenge that I have with education in general is that we structure it so much. And so it's
overly structured.
I feel a lot of the time like some of the students I meet are not able to think for themselves. And sometimes even like we were talking about this with a few friends the other day and thinking about university was one of the first times that I was thought to actually think critically, like challenged to think critically and have an opinion about something. And I had this really amazing faculty member when I was in business school, and he was like, if you want to do well in a job opportunity, have opinions. Any opinions that you want, just have them, be able to express them. And I think a lot of that real life, quote unquote, component is missing in that we structure these bubbles that don't allow for people to have failure experiences. They don't allow for people to, you know, get out there and struggle. And a lot of the times faculty members are concerned about exactly what Andy's saying. Like, well, what if the students have a bad experience with the industry partners? Well, you know, what if
either way, it's an experience.
What if they take a bad job? Like it's a good experience for you to go through that. And if we can do it, the more that we can do it, the better and easier it'll become for people to cope and adapt in those situations.
Right. Do you want to
it's going on something I read about mental health and graduates and sort of coming out, and I think it's sort of, there's many reasons that I'll do my sort of thing now. I'm not a mental health specialist or anything, but it's if you don't sort of teach failure, then when it happens to people that aren't used to it, it's crushing. And I think it's something like a lesson can be learned from success and failure, and that should be taught from a very, very young age, because there's guarantees in life, and failure will be one of them. Nobody's like, if you go to
immune to it.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, the people that are the most successful always talk about how many times they failed to get to where they are. And that's something where we don't teach that. Like we only focus on the success side of things, but to get to success, there's always these hurdles and these traps that people had to go through to get there. And you know, there's lots and lots of billionaires or gurus out there that talk about this, and you know, it's kind of funny. You get sort of you watch LinkedIn or something and videos, it's like they just talk about the same sort of thing, but it's true. Like they're all saying the same thing, like fail fast and you know, pick yourself up, dust yourself down, and then move on.
Totally.
Very cool. One last point, I guess, before we move on to the next question is, do you think also there's sort of a lack in communication in terms of what students are being taught? Because and what I mean by that is, like, let's say I was a science student, and throughout the process of being in labs, writing reports, learning the scientific method and data analysis, like there are all these skills that we were being taught just by being science students that no one told us we were being taught. Do you know what I mean? Like because students aren't able to market themselves and talk about all of the skills that they have and how they've applied it and how they apply it day to day. Do you know what I mean? Like, as a science student, I'm speaking to my own experience. The biggest value add for me was the framework of the scientific method, right? So like the 10-step framework of how to treat anything like a science experiment. And in a lot of ways, our wave is also a science experiment, right? A calculated one. But does that make sense?
Yes,
like,
absolutely.
Students aren't, like, no one's telling them, oh, we're teaching you resiliency, or this is, it's okay to fail, because this whole practice in a controlled environment is a lot better than you actually trying to get up from rock bottom in real life, but that's going to happen.
Yeah.
Right? Anyways, just a thought.
No, that definitely makes sense. And we call it, it's a challenge of students being able to actually describe the skills that they've learned, not so much a challenge of not having skills. And I think that part of it is that we, at least in traditional higher education, I think it's quite different at Red, but we don't talk about skills.
Right.
And I guess in the traditional sense, your learning outcomes would be skills, but it's never described in that way. And so I find that students don't have the ability to actually go to a job interview and explain these
Right.
skills that they've demonstrated through normal classroom-based work. And so that's when all of a sudden, if you're doing it in industry or with an industry partner, now that's a skill. Now that's something that you could speak to. But before you had them, you just weren't able to communicate
Yeah.
them.
But that's super valuable, do you know, in recognizing what you've learned, how you've applied it, and marketing that to a potential employer, I think is a big gap, because it's not that students aren't skilled, it's that they don't know how to articulate what they're skilled at.
Yeah.
So flipping it back to you guys and your roles at Red and Ripen, how have you guys, so you both work with teams that are super agile, nimble, right, in somewhat
try.
startup environments. How in your own teams and in sort of your day-to-day at Red and Ripen do you incentivize innovation?
Wow.
That's literally the reaction to every question.
We obviously came prepared.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, I think for us at Ripen, and I won't take credit for this because it's very much Dana
and Dave.
Yeah, and also I think it's what is great about leadership, also dangerous about leadership, but mostly great, is that the values that are instilled at the top really do trickle down.
Right.
And I think one of the things that we've done really well is told people that it's okay to fail. And I think that that's it's kind of a theme of the conversation we've been having, but like, how do we teach people to not be afraid? And that's something that we've done really well. And so people are okay innovating because they know that if it falls flat, we'll pick them up and it'll be okay. It'll be one more thing that we learn to not do.
Right.
And then the other thing Andy and I were chatting about just before this actually is building trust. Like, do you trust your team enough to let them fail? And do they trust you enough to know that once they do that, you'll be there to actually support them in that failure? And then I think that kind of trust leads to all kinds of innovation. And like, culture is at the core of absolutely everything.
Big. Yeah.
And the big thing within culture is trust.
Yeah, mirroring exactly that. I think we're all super busy people in our day-to-day lives, and if somebody's got an idea and they put together a business case for that, we're happy to support them with funds or resources to run at it. But we can set in KPIs to measure success, and the people at Red that have been incredibly successful have, they've owned an idea and then they've built kind of a different business unit. And I think rewarding people that take ownership is key. And I've worked in sort of not education but larger organizations where you just had to do your time. Like, why did they get a promotion? They've been here 8 years. And that person might not be, there's tons of other people under them that are doing amazing work or new ideas, but it's just not their time yet. And that's where I think innovation just kind of dies, and those good people move on because they're shackled by this old thinking. And I think sort of Ripen and Red are definitely sort of, by the sounds of it, here's the tools, run at it, and we'll check in and make sure, like, if it all fails, like, what went wrong. That's the big thing where I think we don't want it to fail, obviously, but it's if we do feel there's something we can take away from it, it's not all bad news.
Right. Being in companies that are also in education that talk a lot about innovating on education, and the industry side probably looking at more things than just credentials to hire. Do you guys have any innovative hiring practices or ways that you identify talent that you would say isn't necessarily the norm?
I mean, yeah, for sure for us. So for us, we do hire based on projects, which is, practicing what we preach. We talk to companies all day about how engaging with students on projects is a great way to identify potential talent. And the way in which Ripen hires is through using a challenge-based model. So the way into a job at Ripen is completing a challenge that asks you a really simple question. So pitch us your ideal role at Ripen and tell us why we can't live without you. And I love it because it's broad enough that it lets people do whatever they want within it. So my big frustration with interviewing is that it's suited to a very specific type of person.
Right.
And I know a lot of people who are fantastic, they just don't interview well. And it's a very specific skill set that allows you to thrive in that environment. So I think with the challenge, you can put different things out there. And we've gotten all kinds of really cool stuff. Like we had a comic book submission. We've had video doodles where they get the pen and they do that cool thing.
Like the cool thing?
Also, obviously everyone knows what that is. But it's, you know what I mean? It's way better than sitting and looking through a stack of resumes that don't differentiate you at all. Like, I don't know who this person is. And especially if we're talking about fresh graduates, all of their resumes look the exact same. They are literally formatted in the exact same way because their co-op and career office told them to all format it the same way. And so how do you filter through that? And I think that that's a really cool thing that we do.
Yeah, I mean, we're quite lucky in the fact that we've hired a lot of students from Red.
Andy puts them through the Red program and hires them.
So we've got to know people for over 3 or 6 months. So we've had some real success there. But it's when it comes to sort of instructors, we don't hire from a sort of an education background. We hire from an industry background, so it's a challenge. Education doesn't pay as high as a lot of industry, but we're lucky enough to work with some people that have reached a stage in their career where they want to give back, and they're incredibly passionate about it. So we're lucky in that standpoint. And I look after sort of the commercial side, so it's a little bit more sort of black and white of looking at past sales and stuff, but we do try and get innovative of nothing as exciting as the doodle thing. I'm going to look into that and figure out if we need to get this going. But, setting challenges and getting them thinking, because we're going through sort of big changes all the time, and we're looking at ways to innovate, and we need people who are going to be problem solvers. And again, I go back to a bit like comfortable with uncertainty, and those people that are they think on the spot. They've got that ability to solve a problem. They bring a lot more to the table than just somebody transactionally selling something, which we don't do. It's an experience. So
right, very cool. On to our last sort of segment about priorities and immediate actions. Right, like I think throughout the conversation we spoke a little bit. We spoke a little bit about the gap that exists, the challenges that come with it, and the opportunity for different demographics or demographic groups onto what we can do about it, right? And because it's also a multi-stakeholder ecosystem, it's not just it's not just you're in your silo and I'm in my silo and we'll just function like that, right? That's not the world we live in anymore. What would you say an immediate action could be for students graduating today, or students who are still in school that are worried about their next step or their career? Within the context, I guess, of is your education future-proof?
I think for me, like what I have written down on this, but what I was thinking about earlier is that as students, we now have so much more available information to us. Yeah. And I think that before, people made education-based decisions based on advice from their parents and then whatever university or college was closest to them that they knew had a good reputation. But now there's so much available data. So I think my advice to students would be really think about the investment that you're making and research based on what it is that you want to get out of it. And the information is there. You just need to look for it and make sure that what you're doing is aligning with where you're wanting to head down the road.
Right. Yeah, that's good advice.
Sort of priorities and immediate action for students. I think I don't want to be boring and just that would be the shameless plug. I'd never get away with that.
Applications are open.
July 2nd, deadline. No, I think it goes research. There's a bunch out there, course compare or anything like that. It is easy for people to go out there and find this and find what's right for them, and I think especially for me, and not sort of so much focusing on students, it's sort of, I can talk to the experience at Red, is go and have coffees with as many people as possible.
Right.
Like
network.
Network, build your network. You don't start building your network once you graduate. You build it throughout the full time, whether you're networking at events or if you're grabbing coffees with people or actually going to people that you respect and like to speak at events. Like that should be what you should always be doing, just to find out if this is the right thing for you. To Danny's point, like people are ready to give up their time and answer questions for people, because we've all been there. And if you can find out as early as possible, like, okay, finance isn't the world for me, like you're going to save yourself a lot of heartache and pain. And you won't come and visit me. You've chosen the right course from the word go. But it's I think that's the biggest thing. Like, research as much as you can.
There are also so many pathways now, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not like Danny was mentioning earlier, it's not just you go to school, K to 12, go to some sort of post-secondary institution and then get a job and then die. It's that whole model's been disrupted, right? So I would say there are a lot of options out there right now, and trying to figure out what fits you is maybe a good place to start.
Totally.
Right?
Totally. And how you learn what works best for you.
Yeah. For educators, where would you say they could start in? Because I feel like educators, so here's how I think about it. If educators have such an important role in this whole ecosystem, and if not the most important role, because of educators, talent is developed, right? Or another way I could put it is, I know in my own experience, if I had a subject matter that I really liked and a prof I didn't, I would not like the subject matter. Do you know what I mean? Like that, or vice versa. If I had like a course that I hated or didn't like or wasn't interested in, but the prof was just amazing, like now I like the course, right? So educators have such a pivotal role in this whole conversation. Where would you say they could start?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I would really love to see a world in which educators are pushing for innovation. And I think innovation meaning for the benefit of their students, but also innovation for themselves and what their roles look like. So I think my advice to educators would just be to really not be afraid to push the boundaries and redefine. For example, there's this really cool movement in the US right now happening towards teaching tracks. So I speak more to like traditional faculty, but usually there's been only one track to get to tenure, which then means that that's really the only time that faculty members have job security. That's an oversimplified version, but it's a very complex world within academia. And one of the things that they're innovating on is now there's a teaching track and a research track. So if you want to focus on just teaching, that's okay. You can focus on teaching and innovating within teaching, and then you can still get to that place in your career. So it's not holding you back.
Right.
So I think that getting together, like pushing an educator union, but like getting together and like really thinking about like, what do we want the future to look like for ourselves and for our students, and pushing the boundaries and driving forward that innovation, challenging the red tape and challenging the institutions and the way that they work and asking questions.
Right.
I think just building on that, partnerships is key. You as educators, you don't have to do it all yourself. There's organizations out there that can move things along so much faster. And I think for educators to be successful, there needs to be less stringent ways about creating partnerships, and just choosing the right ones and making it clear, like, this is what success looks like, this is what we own, this is what you own. I think that will help everybody along with lightening the load around just work or innovating in new courses or anything like that. I think it would just be really helpful for them and everybody in the sector.
Cool. And parents also have a big role to play in this, because, well, I mean, I come from an Indian household or a Punjabi household where my parents are obsessed with carving out my future, right?
All the aunties.
Yo, man, if I always get comparisons every call. Okay, never mind.
That's another podcast.
Yeah.
The role of parents and all of this. But what do you say, or how do you think parents can better support students who now live in a world where it isn't black and white anymore? It isn't I go to school and get a job, right? And jobs themselves look different because there are a lot of contract-based jobs. There's a gig economy. What would you say the role that parents have in helping or supporting students through this?
I think this is gonna. I don't have kids, so this is gonna be a very sort of comment from me. But I think they need to listen to their kids and what they want to do.
My dad's watching this. Did you hear that?
Parents, all they want is the best thing for their children, and it's that sort of old sort of mindset of like, I'm going to pay for you to go to university or support you to go to university, and then that's it. I'm not responsible anymore. But it's right, the world doesn't work like that anymore. And I think if the reasons are right, go to university. Universities are fantastic institutions, and they do more than just educate. They create life skills. They create your first network. But if it's not right for your son, daughter, then it's there are other mediums out there, like online learning or boot camps, or just to send them traveling to other places. There's lots out there, but it really comes down to that person. And it's scary to say, like, I don't have kids, I'm already like regretting it. I mean, like, this is going to come back and haunt me. But like, they know what they want in their life, so that's where you need to sort of support them and do the best, I think.
Totally. I think for me, I'd love to see parents broadening their horizons about potential routes and really getting out there and learning about what's available. So I think as parents, or at least the parents that I know, not my parents, oddly, but they always give their children advice based on what they know and what they did. And so the way that they got to where they currently are now is the only way that they know. And so I think that a lot of the times that advice comes from a really good place, but the world that we live in is not the same world that our parents lived in. And so I feel like parents give advice from the same place, but the world looks totally different. And so I think that the best thing as a parent that you can do is get out there and learn about all of the different routes that are available. And I think that if parents did that, they might find that there are different, better alternatives for their students that are available, or for their kids that are available, and then be able to make recommendations based on the information that is relevant today, not 30 years ago when they went to school.
Right. And Andy, did you have anything to wrap it up?
I was just thinking if I actually went back and spoke to my dad when he's like, "You're going to university," I was like, "No, okay." And I think if I could put myself back, I'd like push myself into something like an apprenticeship where I was working and learning. Right. And I think like in England, it's a very old-fashioned way of like you're either a bricklayer or an electrician, which they're making way more money than I am, both of those trades. But it's I feel like there's new apprenticeships, like digital apprenticeships, or like there's lots of these things, and I think that's something where, again, you're right. There's listening to the child that you're looking to send, but researching and listening to them, and then looking at what is available for them, because again, it's only with that knowledge you can actually make informed decisions. So.
Great. And lastly, for industry, what do you think industry's role is in keeping up with the different pathways that exist and the unconventional ways that talent is being developed nowadays, as opposed to a funnel straight from university?
I'm going to be hopefully not making anybody angry.
Andy's got some heated
I'm just
opinion.
Like, this is a tough one. Like an easy fix, I think, would be to make job descriptions better. And like that's
just
such a
be better.
But it just I think
like interview better.
Give everybody a ripen challenge. I don't understand what the problem is.
Exactly. This doodle thing's going to like stock share overnight. But I think there's a very easy way of making, sort of applying for jobs. They'll put out a job for a junior position and there'll be 1,000 applications, because it won't mean all those people are right applicants, but because it's junior and that's where people think that they'll just go for it. I think there's just a clearer, a better way. There's again, sort of in the tech space, there's a global standard called SFIA, SFIA, and it's just a grading system specifically for hiring. Like if you're a Sophia level 3 web developer, then that's how you would post your job description, and that way they're speaking to the right people and the developers know that they're going for the right jobs. But that's what I see as a quick fix. But for industry to sort of work with education a lot better, I think they've got to get more involved, and with the work that Riipen are doing, creating projects that future potential employees understand. So when they start at the job, they get up to speed faster. They understand the work that they do. They understand how their teams work. And then a lot of companies do a great job, but I think if they can align themselves closer to education, then they'll get better hires ultimately.
I agree. Yeah, I think, the biggest thing for industry, based on my experience, is that we need to stop playing what I call the ping pong game, because I find that education institutions are like, well, industry is not getting involved, and then industry's like, well, educational institutions aren't getting involved. And then ultimately, it's only the students that are graduating that are suffering from these conditions. And I think that it really does take a village and everybody needs to get involved. So I think industry needs to step up to the plate. Like if you want better talent, you need to be willing to nurture it. And if you think about the way that the system worked back in the good old days, people would get hired out of university, but then they would be trained into the jobs that they were going to be doing.
Right.
And obviously that happened because there was a little bit more security for employers that those people would stay in those jobs for a lifetime. And so we're looking at different conditions now, but that doesn't change the fact that industry has their share of responsibility in developing talent. And I think that if we remove the conversation and think bigger picture, like I think if you're talking about developing talent for your organization today to work with you for the next 2 years and make an investment in that way, then yeah, the business case isn't there. But if you talk about developing talent generally, and you developing talent and other companies also developing talent, and then there just being a free flow as opposed to this protectionist mentality,
right?
I think that we can start having a much more interesting conversation about what the future of skills and talent development looks like, and not necessarily just for you, but as an overall ecosystem, how we can be better.
Very cool. And I guess we're at the end of the episode. So to wrap it up, what is one thought or question or just concept that you'd leave everyone listening or even watching with around the theme of whether education today is future-proof?
I think like one word would be like collaboration. That's the big thing for me. Just to Danny's point, everybody in the ecosystem needs to have skin in the game. So if we all sort of do our bit, then it works. If one part of that stops and they're just taking it, it sort of falls apart.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think specific to the theme of is your education future-proof, I feel like it's really about challenging yourself to be a lifelong learner and think about what that's going to look like for you. And I think that's both exciting and terrifying, especially when we look at the cost of education. So I think we as a society need to start looking at different ways of learning, different avenues for sharing learning and resources. And yeah, collaboration is a huge part of that. But yeah, for me, it's about lifelong learning and figuring out how we as people can become more comfortable with that idea at every stage. So not just recent graduates, but mid-career workers and retired people. Like, how can we continuously be better versions of ourselves?
Wow, very cool. Thank you guys for making time. And I know today's game day. Go Rockers go. Big thank you to Revive Films, who are our videographers and also post-production geniuses. And yeah, just I'm in awe of you guys and the work that you do. And cannot believe you came on my podcast. So
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for
yeah, and
having
thank
us.
you for everyone who's listened and tuned in. But the podcast will be available on all streaming platforms, so Apple Podcast, iTunes, Spotify, everything, and a full-length video on YouTube too, so check it out. But yeah, till next time. Thank you guys.
Thank you for having us.